Wow, this
Welcome
place
back
is
to my channel. I
incredible!
hope you enjoy this one.
So many things to see and smell.
The first thing May Suthikai heard when she stepped off the pier walkway and into Wong Lang Market was a bell. Small, tinny, almost nothing, the kind of sound a child's anklet makes when he runs. She stopped walking. For one full second, 37 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer that cost more than most of the vendors around her would see in a month, rolling a hardshell suitcase behind her like an anchor, May Suthikai forgot how to breathe. If you are watching this video, comment your country. Then a motorbike horn blared somewhere behind the noodle stalls. A woman laughed too loudly over a vat of boiling broth, and the sound was gone, swallowed by the market the way the market swallowed everything. Smoke, steam, prayer, grief. May exhaled, pressed two fingers briefly against her sternum as if resetting something internal, and kept walking. She had 90 minutes. Maybe less, if the river traffic backed up the way it had every evening this week. Her driver was stuck 3 bridges away in gridlock that wasn't moving. Her connecting flight to Hong Kong left at 9:40, and the only way to make the pier in time was to cut on foot through Wong Lang, through the covered lanes of fried bananas and pirated DVDs and dried squid hung like laundry, through the market she had built an entire life, an entire country, an entire continent of distance from. She had not set foot here in 15 years. She had told herself it was simply the fastest route. She had told herself a great many things in the last 2 hours, ever since her assistant in Singapore had rerouted her through Bangkok because of a mechanical delay, ever since she'd realized, looking at the gate number, that the layover would put her exactly 400 meters from a place she had spent a decade and a half making sure she never had to look at again. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Richard Tan, investor call flashed on the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, already moving, the suitcase wheels catching on uneven brick. "Tell me your past customs," Richard said, no greeting, the clipped Singaporean cadence she'd known for 9 years. "I will be. May. The Hang Sung signing is tomorrow at 8. If you are not on that plane." "I'll be on the plane, Richard." "You sound out of breath." "I'm walking fast." A pause, the kind Richard used when he was deciding whether to push. He had pulled her out of the wreckage of her old life 9 years ago, hired a half-starved silk stall vendor with a finance degree she'd never used and a stare that frightened junior associates, built her into the sharpest CFO in his portfolio, and in exchange he believed, with the unshakable certainty of a man who had once watched her fall apart completely, that he had earned the right to worry about her like this. He wasn't wrong to worry. He was only wrong about why. "Call me when you're at the gate," he said, and hung up before she could answer. May put the phone away and kept walking into the heart of the market, past a man stacking durians into a pyramid, past a girl selling jasmine garlands from a tray balanced on her head, past the smell of garlic and chili oil, and the river underneath it all, brown and patient, and exactly where she'd left it. She did not look at the silk stalls. There weren't any left. They'd been replaced years ago by a stall selling phone cases, but her feet still knew where they used to be, and she kept her eyes fixed forward, on the lane ahead, on the pier, on Hong Kong, on anywhere but here. 40 meters away, at a noodle cart wedged between a fruit stand and a stall of second-hand children's clothes, Anong Srisai was losing an argument with a delivery driver. 20 kilos, not 15, she said, jabbing a finger at the invoice. "I paid for 20. Boss says 15, that's what the truck had. Then your boss owes me 5 kilos of pork or 500 baht, I don't care which." It was the kind of argument that happened 4 times a week and meant nothing, except that today it happened at exactly the wrong moment, the way small disasters always do, not through any single failure, but through an accumulation of ordinary ones. Anong's husband, Decca, was up on a ladder 15 feet away, wrestling a torn tarp back onto its frame before the evening rain that was already gathering, dark and heavy, somewhere over the river. Their son was supposed to be sitting on the overturned crate beside the cash box, where he always sat, drawing motorbikes on the backs of old receipts with a stub of pencil. His name was Boone. He was 4 years old, small for his age, with a gap where his front tooth had fallen out 2 weeks earlier, and a habit of narrating everything he did out loud, to no one in particular, in a running commentary that Anong had long since learned to tune out the way she tuned out traffic noise. What she had not tuned out, what she would replay in her mind 100 times in the hours that followed, was the small brass bell sewn onto the anklet around Boone's left ankle. A Buddhist tradition, a mother's quiet superstition, meant to ward off bad luck, and more practically, to let her hear exactly where her son was at any moment without having to look. She had stopped hearing it 3 minutes ago. She had not noticed. Boone had wandered exactly the way 4-year-olds wander, without intention, without fear, drawn by something brighter and louder than the crate he'd been sitting on. A man 2 stalls down was pushing a cart with a striped umbrella, ringing a small hand bell of his own, and on the side of the cart, in faded pink letters, was a picture of an ice cream cone taller than Boone himself. He had no money. This did not occur to him as a problem. "I want one," he announced to the cart, to the umbrella, to the general vicinity, with the absolute confidence of a child who had never once in his life wanted something and not eventually gotten it. The vendor, busy with another customer, didn't look down. Boone repeated himself, louder, planting his feet, and when that didn't work either, he did what he always did when the world failed to respond to him quickly enough. He reached up with both hands and began to wail, a single sustained note of pure outrage, the kind of sound that could clear a room. It cleared a small radius of market instead. 3 people glanced over, judged it none of their business, and moved on, because that was how a crowded market worked. Everyone's child was, theoretically, everyone's responsibility, and therefore, in practice, no one's. May almost did the same thing. She was 11 meters away, moving fast, the suitcase wheels rattling over the broken brick, when the sound reached her. Not the crying itself, which was unremarkable. Children cried in markets the way roosters crowed at dawn. But underneath it, with every step the boy took as he stamped his feet, the small bright ring of a bell against his ankle. She stopped for the second time in 15 minutes. She told herself later that she had simply seen a lost child and done what any decent person would do. It was true, as far as it went. It left out the part where her body had stopped moving before her mind had caught up to why. The part where for one disorienting half-second the boy crying by the ice cream cart had her son's exact hairline. The cowlick at the crown that never lay flat no matter how carefully you wet it down. It wasn't him. Of course it wasn't him. Her son would be 19 now if... She didn't finish the thought. She never finished that thought. She had built 9 years of a very successful life on the specific skill of not finishing that thought. She walked over to the cart instead. "Hey," she said, crouching, which her tailored skirt did not love and which she did anyway. "Hey, what's wrong?" Boone stopped crying with the suddenness of a tap turned off, looked at her, and delivered his verdict with total clarity. "I want ice cream." Up close he looked nothing like her son. Rounder face, darker skin, a chipped front tooth where her son's had still been baby smooth. The resemblance had been nothing, a hairline, a height, a half-second of static from an old wound. May felt something in her chest loosen slightly, and then, absurdly, felt the loss of that imagined resemblance like its own small grief. "Where's your mom?" she asked. Boone considered this question with the seriousness of someone being asked to solve an equation, looked left, looked right, and pointed with total confidence in a direction that, as it happened, was wrong. "I want ice cream," he said again, in case she'd missed it the first time. May looked at her watch. 78 minutes. She looked at the boy, who was already eyeing the cart's striped umbrella with the unwavering focus of someone who had moved past negotiation into expectation. "1 scoop," she said, mostly to herself, and stood up to buy it. It would become later, though May did not know this yet, standing at a cart counting out 20 baht for a coconut-flavored scoop in a paper cup. One of those small decisions a life quietly turns on. She would think, afterward, about how close she had come to simply finding the nearest stall holder, saying there's a lost child here, and walking on toward her flight with a clean conscience and an unbothered schedule. It was, in fact, what she had half intended to do. It was what any reasonable person with 90 minutes and a board meeting in Hong Kong would have done. Instead, she handed Boone the ice cream, watched his entire face transform into uncomplicated joy, and made the second mistake of her evening, which was looking, even briefly, like someone safe. Boone finished roughly a third of the scoop in 4 enormous bites, looked up at her with chocolate-stained satisfaction, and reached up to take her hand. "Okay," he said, as if they had agreed on something. "Let's go." "No, sweetheart, I'm not. I have to find your mom." "I know," Boone said patiently, the way one explains something obvious to someone slow. "Let's go find her." He tugged her hand toward the lane that led, as it happened, deeper into the market, away from his parents' stall, away from anywhere either of them had any business going. May looked down at the small hand wrapped entirely around 2 of her fingers, sticky with melted ice cream, gripping with the specific unbreakable confidence of a child who has decided an adult belongs to him now, and felt something underneath her ribs that she did not have a name for and did not want one. "This way," she said instead, turning him gently back toward the noodle stalls, toward, she hoped, someone who might recognize him. "Let's try this way." He came without protest. He had decided she was in charge of finding his mother, and having delegated the problem successfully, returned his full attention to the ice cream. It took 11 minutes of asking. A fruit seller, a man selling lottery tickets, two teenagers filming something for their phones who barely looked up before anyone recognized him. "That's Anong's boy," said a woman selling fried bananas, wiping her hands on her apron. "Noodle stall, by the old pier entrance. You go straight, then left at the monk statue." May thanked her and started walking, faster now, Boone trotting to keep pace, still holding her hand, ice cream cup nearly empty and held with the careful possessiveness of someone guarding treasure. Her phone buzzed again. She almost didn't answer it, and then did, because not answering Richard rarely solved anything. "Where are you?" he said. Not a question. A demand dressed as one. "There's a lost child. I'm helping find his parents." A silence stretched long enough that she could picture his exact expression. The small flex of jaw he did when something didn't compute, the specific frustration of a man who had spent 9 years building a narrative about who May Suthakai was and did not enjoy contradictory evidence. "You're joking." "I'm not." "May. The car. The flight. The signing tomorrow is worth $400 million, and you cannot reschedule a board of Hong Kong investors because of a stray kid in a market." "He's not a stray. He has parents looking for him somewhere in this market right now, and nobody else has stopped to help." "That is not your job." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She didn't explain further, because she didn't have an explanation that would survive being spoken out loud, and because Boone had just announced, with the air of someone making polite conversation, "My tooth is gone, see," and tilted his face up to show her the gap, entirely unbothered by the call happening 12 inches above his head. "I have to go," May said, and hung up while Richard was still talking, which she had not done to him in 9 years. She found the monk statue. She turned left. She did not find a noodle stall with a frantic mother. Instead, she found a wall of moving bodies, the evening crowd thickening as the dinner rush began, vendors calling out prices, the first fat drops of rain starting to fall on the corrugated roofing overhead in a rising static hiss, and somewhere in the middle of it, an old woman sitting behind a cart of boat noodles, who looked up at May's face and went very, very still. "Excuse me," May said, crouching slightly so Boone's face was visible. "Do you know this little boy? Someone said his mother has a stall near here." The old woman, small, sun-creased, a single gray braid pinned beneath a faded scarf, was not looking at Boone at all. She was looking at May, at her face, with an intensity that made May's skin prickle, the way a stranger's recognition feels wrong before you understand why. "Kun May," the old woman said. Not a question. May's stomach dropped through the brick floor. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Have we met?" The old woman, Yai Samsri, though May did not yet know the name, set down her ladle with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving May's face, and said the thing that would end part 1 of this story exactly where it needed to end, on the precipice of a truth 15 years buried under noodle smoke and silk thread and an ocean of careful distance. "You used to sell scarves," she said quietly, "by the old pier gate. Before." Rain began to fall harder against the tin roofing, a sudden roar that swallowed the market's noise into something close to silence beneath it. Boone, oblivious, tugged at May's sticky fingers and asked when they were going to find his mommy. May did not answer him. She was looking at the old woman's face, at the boat noodle cart that had sat in this exact spot. She remembered now, the memory arriving not gently but like a blow. 15 years and 2 months ago, on the last ordinary afternoon of her life, the afternoon a 4-year-old boy with a cowlick that never lay flat had let go of her hand for 11 seconds while she counted change for a tourist, and had not been there when she looked back down. "You were there," May whispered. "The day my son—" She couldn't finish it. She had never once finished that sentence out loud, not to her ex-husband, not to a single one of the therapists she'd stopped seeing within 3 sessions, not to Richard, who knew only the outline and had built an entire protective architecture around never asking for the rest. Yai Samsri reached beneath her cart, into a tin box scarred with rust, and her weathered hand closed around something small enough to hide inside her fist. "I kept something," the old woman said. "I always thought someday the mother might come back." The rain kept falling. Boone kept tugging her hand, asking his small, patient question over and over, and somewhere in the darkening market behind them, a woman named Anong had just looked up from a delivery invoice toward an overturned crate that was, for the first time in 4 years, empty, and begun, very quietly at first, to scream her son's name. Yai Somsri's fist opened slowly, the way old hands do, joint by joint, and in the center of her weathered palm sat a single brass bell, no larger than a fingernail, its surface gone dark with age, still threaded onto a half-inch of frayed red cord. May did not touch it. She could not make her hand move. "It came loose," the old woman said, "in the noodle pot. I found it that night, after everyone had gone, after the police had stopped asking. I cleaned it. I kept it. I told myself if your son ever needed proof he belonged to someone, I would have it ready." She paused, and something in her face cracked open. 15 years of carrying a small, useless object like a vigil. "I never thought it would be you standing here instead of him." The rain hammered the tin roof. Boone, 3 feet away, had stopped tugging at May's hand and was watching the old woman with the open, unembarrassed curiosity children have for adult grief they don't yet understand. "I have to find his mother," May heard herself say, and it came out steadier than she felt, because some part of her, the part that had built 9 years of armor out of exactly this kind of moment, understood that if she let herself stop now, here, she would not get up again. "We'll talk. I promise we'll talk. But there's a woman somewhere in this market who doesn't know where her son is, and I am not going to let her have the night I had." Yai Somsri closed her fist around the bell, nodded once, and said only, "Pier Gate. Ask for Net. He knows every alley in this market better than the rats do." Anong's scream had already traveled 4 stalls in either direction by the time May and Boone reached the noodle cart, which in Wonglang Market was all it took. A lost child was the one emergency every vendor understood without explanation, because every one of them had, at some point, looked up from a customer or a delivery or a boiling pot and felt the cold drop of a missing small shape where one had been a moment before. Within 90 seconds, 6 people were moving. Within 3 minutes, it was 20. Decca had come down off his ladder so fast he'd torn his palm on the tarp frame and hadn't noticed. Anong was standing in the middle of the lane, spinning in place, calling Boone's name into a crowd too dense and too loud to carry it anywhere useful, and it was in the middle of that spin that she saw him. Small, sticky-handed, alive, walking toward her holding the hand of a stranger in an expensive blazer. And the sound she made then was not a scream at all, but something with no name, something that came from underneath language entirely. She was on her knees in the mud before May had finished saying his name, gathering Boone against her so hard he made a small surprised noise, and over his head she looked up at May with an expression that asked 100 questions and could only manage one. "Where?" "Ice cream cart, near the pier entrance." He was crying. "I'm sorry, I should have found you faster." "You found him." Anong was crying now, openly, still holding Boone, who had decided this was an enormous amount of fuss over something he considered already resolved, and was trying to show his mother the chocolate stain on his shirt. "You stayed with him. You didn't just," she couldn't finish it either. Grief and relief, it turned out, used the same unfinished sentences. Decca arrived, scooped Boone up bodily, pressed his face into his son's hair, and over the boy's shoulder. His eyes found May's with the particular intensity of a father doing arithmetic on how close the evening had come to going a different way. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough words for what he meant, and they both knew it, and it would have to do. It should have ended there. By every reasonable measure of the evening, it had ended there. A lost child found, a debt of gratitude exchanged, a stranger free to return to the business of catching a flight she had already, technically, missed. May felt the pull of it, the clean exit available to her, the version of tonight where she went home with a good story and nothing else. She thought of the bell in Yai Somsri's fist instead. "There's something I need to do first," she said, mostly to herself, and turned back into the market. Her phone had been ringing for 11 minutes by the time she finally answered it, walking fast through a lane that smelled of wet brick and frying garlic, the rain easing now to a steady curtain rather than a roar. "You missed the flight," Richard said. "Flat. Final. Not a question this time. I know. There is a backup at 11:40. If you leave now." "I'm not coming tonight, Richard." The silence on the line was longer than any she'd heard from him in 9 years of late-night calls and emergency meetings and crises with 8-figure consequences. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the clipped efficiency entirely. "May, I built this firm with you standing next to me specifically because you don't do this. You don't disappear mid-crisis. That is the entire reason the board trusts you with $400 million. Because 9 years ago, I watched you put yourself back together piece by piece into someone who never, ever does this. I know what you watched, May said quietly. I was there too. Then you understand what you're risking. I understand exactly what I'm risking. I'm asking you to trust me anyway. One more time. There was a sound on the line that might have been Richard exhaling, or might have been something closer to fear. The specific fear of a man who had spent 9 years quietly terrified of the day May Suthikai stopped running, because he had never been entirely sure what would be left of her on the other side of stopping. I'll handle the board, he said finally, gruffly, in the tone of a man surrendering a position he knew he'd already lost. Don't make me regret this. I won't. She hung up before he could change his mind. And for the first time in 9 years, the silence after a call with Richard Tan didn't feel like relief at having survived him. It felt like the first full breath she'd taken since she'd stepped off the pier walkway 2 hours earlier. The pier gate, when she found it, was a low concrete archway strung with a single bare bulb that buzzed against the rain. A young man was tying off a long-tail boat against the current, moving with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this 10,000 times, rain running off a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I'm looking for Net, May said. He looked up. 19, maybe 20, lean in the way of someone who worked outdoors for a living. A face that didn't immediately strike her as anything but a stranger's face, ordinary, unremarkable, rain-wet. That's me. Yai Somsri sent me. She said you know the market better than anyone. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, not yet, but the particular alertness of someone who heard the old woman's name and straightened automatically. The way you do for someone who has quietly mattered to you your whole life without anyone explaining why. Yai Somsri sent you, he repeated. What do you need? There was a missing child tonight. He's been found, he's safe, but I made a promise to look for someone else while I was here. A long time ago, someone I lost in this market. I don't even know where to start looking after 15 years, but I told her I'd try. She didn't know why she told him that much. It wasn't the kind of thing she told strangers. She had built an entire career on not telling strangers exactly this kind of thing. But there was something about the rain, and the bell still sitting in her coat pocket where Yai Somsri had pressed it into her hand at the last second. Keep it, you'll know when it's time, and something about the steadiness in this boy's face that made the sentence come out before she'd decided to say it. Net was quiet for a moment, coiling rope around his forearm with the automatic motion of muscle memory, looking at her in a way that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with the specific kindness of someone who had grown up around people the market had failed and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to be one more person who looked past them. Come inside, he said. Out of the rain. Yai Somsri's been waiting 15 years for someone to ask her that question. You should hear the whole thing properly, sitting down with tea. The full story took 20 minutes to tell, in the cramped warmth of Yai Somsri's stall with the rain drumming overhead and 3 cups of tea going cold between them, and it took every one of those 20 minutes for May to keep her hands from shaking. 15 years ago, the search for a 4-year-old boy lost near the silk stalls had gone on for 6 hours before anyone thought to check downriver, past the temple steps, where the current carried things that fell or were pushed from the pier. A fisherman named Sampong, Yai Somsri's late husband's cousin, Net's grandfather, though Net did not yet know this part of the sentence was about to include him, had found a half-drowned boy clinging to a mooring post near the temple at dusk, barely conscious, unable to give his own name through shock and swallowed river water. He brought the boy to the temple monks, who'd brought him to the hospital, who had, through a clerical accident no one had ever managed to fully untangle, filed the report under the wrong district. The same week May collapsed from exhaustion and grief and was hospitalized herself for 11 days, unreachable, while her husband, destroyed in his own way, failed to follow up on a search he no longer had the strength to keep fighting. By the time May resurfaced, the file had gone cold. By the time anyone thought to cross-reference it, 8 months had passed, the boy had a new district, a new file, and, because no family came forward in the legally mandated window, because 2 grieving adults had simply stopped being able to look, a new home, with Sampong, who could not have any more children of his own, and who had never, not once in 15 years, considered the boy anything other than his. I always knew there was a chance, Yai Somsri said quietly. I kept the bell because somewhere I believed his mother was still out there, still looking, even when the police stopped. I didn't know how to find you. I only knew, if you ever came back to this market, I would be sitting in exactly this spot, and I would be ready. May looked at Ned. He had gone very still, the cup of tea forgotten between his hands, working through the same arithmetic his face had been doing without realizing it since the words half-drowned boy near the temple had left Yai Somsri's mouth. I don't remember any of it, he said finally, quietly. I've never remembered anything from before I was 5. Grandfather Sompong always said it didn't matter, that I was his however I got there. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over as if they might contain an answer. I used to wonder, when I was a kid, if someone out there was looking. May reached into her coat pocket and took out the bell. She set it on the table between them, the small dark brass piece, the frayed red cord, and beside it, with hands that would not stop trembling now, no matter how hard she tried to make them, she unclasped the thin gold chain she had worn every single day for 15 years without once taking it off, and laid its matching half on the table. 2 bells. The same set, sold in pairs at temple markets, one fastened to a child's ankle for protection, the other kept by the mother who could not bear, even after everything, to stop carrying a piece of him. Net stared at them for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached up and pulled off his baseball cap, and in the bare bulb's unsteady light, May saw it clearly for the first time, the cowlick at his crown that no amount of water or care had ever managed to lay flat. Neither of them said anything for a long time. It wasn't the kind of moment that needed saying. It would be wrong to say everything was resolved that night. May would spend the following months learning, slowly and without guarantees, how to be someone in a young man's life who had built 19 years of identity without her. Not a mother arriving to claim a son back, but something more careful and more honest, a woman earning her way, conversation by conversation, into the edges of a family that had already, kindly and completely, raised him whole. There would be a DNA test, weeks later, more for the paperwork than for either of their hearts, which had already decided. There would be a difficult, necessary conversation with her ex-husband, the first real one in a decade, neither of them quite ready yet to forgive themselves, but finally willing to stop blaming each other for a clerical error and a current neither of them had caused. There would be a meeting with Richard, back in Singapore, where she would resign the CFO position she'd built her entire armor around, and where Richard, gruff, fierce, frightened for her in his own clumsy way, would surprise her by saying only, "I always wondered what you were running from. I'm glad you finally turned around to look." But that was the months that followed, and they belonged to a longer story than one rain-soaked night in a market could hold. What belonged to that night was this. Boone, fed dry, and thoroughly unbothered by the scale of what his ice cream demand had set in motion, fell asleep against his father's shoulder before the rain had fully stopped, one small bell still ringing faintly on his ankle with every breath. Anong pressed a container of pork noodles into May's hands with a fierceness that brooked no argument, said something about luck and kindness coming back around that May didn't have the heart to correct, and meant every word of it more than she could have known. And at a cramped stall table at the edge of Wong Lang Market, while the river ran high and brown beyond the pier and the last vendors began folding their awnings against the night, a mother and a son she had spent 15 years grieving sat across from each other with 2 small bells between them, not yet knowing each other at all, and somehow, impossibly, already beginning to. The market had taken something from her once, in a moment's distance, the kind every parent fears and few survive without scar tissue. It gave something back the same way, not through fate, not through coincidence dressed up as destiny, but through one stranger's decision, on one ordinary evening, not to walk past a crying child toward a flight that could always be rebooked. Can one act of kindness heal a wound that time could not? It cannot on its own. Time still has to do its slow, unglamorous work, the way it always does. But kindness, May would think often in the years that followed, is sometimes the only thing strong enough to turn a person back around to face the wound at all. And once you're facing it, however frightened, however unfinished, healing finally has somewhere to begin. The bell rang softly on the table between them, stirred by nothing but the draft from the open stall front, and neither of them reached to silence it.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Till I catch you the next one, don't forget, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell button so that you can find when I upload new video. We love you. Let's go!